Swinburne University of Technology.
To begin this evening's formalities, we respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners, the people of the Kulin Nation, as the custodians of this land. We also pay respects to all Aboriginal community elders, past and present, who have resided in the area and have been an integral part of the history of this region. We're delighted to see so many of you here this evening for what promises to be a fascinating and engaging lecture. So welcome again, and thank you for joining us. Before we get underway, a couple of housekeeping measures. Firstly, can I ask you to turn your mobile phones off, or at least set them to silent, please. We also have a business card drawer, so those of you who haven't popped your card in the jar, we'll have it waiting at the door for you, so please pop it in on the way out. Also, if you know of other alumni who would be interested in events such as this, please encourage them to get in touch. We'd be delighted to hear from them, and we're very keen to keep them abreast of the things that are happening at Swinburne, because there's a lot going on and we really want to keep engaging with our alumni. Finally, please be aware that tonight's lecture is actually being recorded for podcasting purposes, so any questions that you asked will be published online. And when we have the Q&A session at the end, where you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions, we're passing around a microphone, so please just hold off until you get the mic. That way we'll record your question as well as the answer that's given to you from Gary. It's now my privilege to introduce to you Mr. Bill Scales, who has been Chancellor of Swinburne University of Technology since 2005. Over the past 40 years, Bill has been involved with many boards and committees in the private, government and not-for-profit sectors, holding a number of high-profile leadership roles in both the public and private sectors. In addition to his role at Swinburne, Bill is currently Chairman of the Port of Melbourne Corporation and a Council member of the Victorian Division of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. In 2008, he was a member of the panel of experts that reviewed Australia's higher education sector for the Australian Government. He's held the roles of Group Managing Director of Regulatory, Corporate and Human Relations at Telstra, Secretary at the Department of Premier and Cabinet in Victoria, and Chairman and CEO of the Industry Commission, where he worked with tonight's guest speaker, Gary Banks. He also held senior management roles in the manufacturing sector. Bill has conducted many public inquiries for Australian governments. Currently, he's chairing a review for the Council of Australian Governments into Australia's energy sector. He's also conducting a review of funding for schools for the federal government. Furthermore, he's conducting a review of Victoria's child protection system for the state government. In 1993, Bill was made an officer in the Order of Australia for his services to industry, and in 2003 he was awarded the Centenary Medal for outstanding service to business and commerce. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bill Scales.
Thank you, Michael. It is a great pleasure to see so many of our alumni and friends here again tonight, and thank you very much for coming and being with us. Like our other Chancellor's lectures, I'm sure you'll find this to be a terrific occasion. This is the second Chancellor's lecture for 2011, and it's the sixth actually since we began this series of lectures in 2009. Tonight's lecture will be given by Gary Banks, Chairman of the Productivity Commission. Gary has been the Chairman of the Productivity Commission since 1998. As many of you would know, the Productivity Commission is the Australian Government's main advisory body on microeconomic matters and also many elements of Australia's broad public policy framework. In addition to being the Chairman and the CEO of the Commission, Gary has personally headed for the Commission national inquiries on wide-ranging reform topics such as national competition policy, the national reform agenda, and the economic implications of an ageing population, as well as many other key policy areas in areas such as industry assistance, infrastructure, government services, and regulation. Gary also chairs the review of government service provision for the Council of Australian Governments. In 2006, he chaired the Australian Government's Regulation Task Force. I think it's also fair to say that under Gary's stewardship, the Productivity Commission has become internationally acclaimed for the quality of its work and for its fearless contribution to Australia's public policy discourse. It's also, I think, fair to say, and Gary might blush at this, but he really is one of Australia's most distinguished economists. He's worked at the Centre for International Economics in Canberra and as an economic consultant for the OECD and the World Bank. He served as a senior economist with the GATT Secretariat in Geneva and as a visiting fellow at the Trade Policy Research Centre in London. In 2007, Gary was made an officer in the General Division of the Order of Australia for his services to the development of public policy in microeconomic reform and regulation. Gary's lecture tonight will focus on the importance of the independence of the Productivity Commission and about its contribution to public policy. Please welcome Gary Banks.
Well, thanks, Bill. Thanks very much for the invitation. And Linda Christensen, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to see this wonderful facility. And apparently, although it's got all this glass around it, everybody can still concentrate. And as I was saying earlier, it's probably pretty hard to fall asleep because someone will spot you as well. So congratulations to the university on creating such a wonderful facility. Well, during the past decade, the number of reviews commissioned by governments on key policy issues appears to have increased exponentially. However, the Commission's found in its current review of reviews of regulation, which will be released tomorrow morning, that some of these reviews and inquiries have done better than others in achieving improved outcomes. And to borrow a catchphrase, reviews ain't reviews. How well they're performed has depended not just on whether they've targeted the right issues, but crucially on their governance, their skill base, and how they've gone about their tasks, especially the consultation processes. So in this lecture, I intend to focus on one aspect of governance that stood out as a success factor across a variety of these policy or regulatory reviews, namely independence. And while many reviews have been characterised as independent, in practice this has not always been accepted by stakeholders, and that in itself has affected their influence. I'll speak about independence specifically in relation to the Productivity Commission. This is because independence is integral to the Commission's role in advising governments and informing public opinion. It's also something that as Chairman of the Commission I frequently have cause to reflect on, as no doubt did my predecessor Bill Scales, who was formerly a chairman of the Commission and is now your Chancellor here at Swinburne University. So there are two threshold questions. The first is, why is independence of value in a public policy sense? And the second one is, what does it actually require? The simplest answer to the first question is that governments need advice that's based on a broad understanding of the public interest. Otherwise, the policy-making arena could become dominated by self-interested or ideologically based claims and end up generating exclusively bad outcomes. Claims of that kind are, of course, pervasive in any democracy, and it's what democracy is actually all about. And if all goes well, they should be sorted out by the political decision-making process with advice from different parts of the bureaucracy and vigorous parliamentary debate, ultimately securing courses of action in the national interest, and with the ballot box, of course, providing ultimate adjudication. Now, while the system works tolerably well overall, not perfectly, but as they say, better than any alternative we can think of, it's an empirical fact that much bad policy does nevertheless get through. And the reality is that particularly in complex policy areas or where good evidence is not readily available, self-interested arguments can escape the scrutiny and checks they deserve. Parliamentary debates are often not as well informed as they might be about the choices or trade-offs, and the structure and interests of government departments don't necessarily always facilitate an understanding of what's in the wider public interest. Independent advice, if it's also well-researched public advice, can complement these other institutions by helping governments identify the best ways forward in complex or contentious policy areas. But it can also facilitate implementation by building public confidence that the policy is well-founded and therefore likely to be generally beneficial. In other words, it can increase the trust of the wider community in circumstances where many will not have or be able to acquire a detailed understanding of the particular policies under consideration. So what advice is independent? At bottom, independence essentially hinges on the incentives and constraints that can affect the advisor's ability to be objective and to exercise judgment based on facts and analysis without being unduly influenced by special interests or third parties. This suggests that independence is not an absolute concept. There are degrees of independence. In a formal sense, it depends on the governance arrangements around the advisor, but in a practical sense, it also depends on the resourcing of advisory bodies and on the characteristics of the individuals concerned, their attitudes, their beliefs, as well as their experiences and interests. All these things affect not only how independent a particular source of advice is able to be, but also how independent it is perceived to be. And the latter can be just as important if the advice is to serve the role of enhancing public understanding and trust in the policy-making process. In terms of the governance arrangements, the minimum requirement for formal independence is that the advisory body operates at arm's length from the decision-maker. The more substantive requirement is that the advisor is not able to be unduly influenced by any party, including the decision-maker, and this one's much harder to satisfy. It invokes more subtle considerations of the nature of the relationship between an advisory body and policymaker and how the entity is funded and staffed. In my view, the second requirement is rarely satisfied to a sufficient degree, and this deficiency in many cases has detracted from the contribution of the reviews concerned to achieving better policy outcomes. Now, I won't surprise you if I suggest that the Productivity Commission passes both tests for independence. And further, I believe that this has been fundamental to the Commission's ability to make a sustained contribution over the years. So tonight I'm going to talk briefly about those aspects of the Commission's origins, design and operation that relate to its independence, and I'll consider how that independence, together with other features, has helped public policy, and then allude to some challenges associated with this. Even an independent life wasn't meant to be easy. Well, the Commission's independence is formalised in its statute, the Productivity Commission Act 1998. But key features of this legislation had their origins in the Tariff Board Act, which goes a long way back further to 1922. The Tariff Board has a quasi-judicial role, or had one, in relation to its advice to government. Tariffs involve both winners and losers, and impartiality in making judgments based on the evidence was rightly seen as essential. The same rationale for independence was adopted by Sir John Crawford in his report to Gough Whitlam in 1973 on the replacement of the Tariff Board by an Industries Assistance Commission. The IAC was assigned a similar role, though with a wider remit in the conflicted area of industry assistance. It's back on the agenda. Its purpose, like the Tariff Board, was to provide evidence-based impartial advice, but a crucial difference introduced into its statute was that it was required to take an economy-wide perspective. That is, it must promote the interests of the community as a whole over that of any particular industry or group. Over the years, the Commission's evolved considerably further, and its work now covers much more extensive policy territory than tariffs and other industry assistance. However, the formal statutory independence that had its origins in the Tariff Board has held it in good stead. Indeed, I'd argue that it has facilitated the extensions to its public policy role. Having its own statute is clearly fundamental to the Commission's independence, and the most basic reason I can think of is that it makes it hard to abolish the organisation. That would require legislation to terminate the Act, for which there would need to be reasons that got the support of both Houses of Parliament, and thus reasons that the public itself would broadly accept. There are two aspects of the statute that bear on the Commission's independence. One relates to appointments, and the second to the operations of the Commission, particularly its relationship with the government or minister of the day. In relation to appointments, the independence of the Productivity Commission is embodied in the commissioners, and under the Productivity Commission Act, commissioners can be appointed for up to 5 years. This period has the advantage of spanning more than one electoral cycle. Perhaps more importantly, it gives commissioners job security for their term of appointment. The only grounds for removal of a commissioner are for demonstrated misbehaviour, the dimensions of which are specified, or physical or mental incapacity. That means commissioners can't be sacked merely for giving unwelcome advice on public policy matters. Now, that's quite significant because there's little statutory limitation on the ability of the Commission to offer such advice. Indeed, in conducting an inquiry, the Commission has licence under its statute to, and I quote, make recommendations in the report on any matters relevant to the matter referred. Well, placing that in perspective, however, the Commission has no executive power. It's not a decision maker. Its functions are merely advisory and informational. It's thus really only as influential as the quality of the advice and the information it provides, which depend on the processes, the research and the analysis on which these are based. Secondly, although the Commission can undertake research in support of its other activities, it cannot initiate its own public inquiries, and the inquiries that it is asked to undertake are framed by the government and can be bounded as it sees fit. For example, our recent study on carbon policies around the world, carbon abatement policies, was restricted to a comparative assessment of measures in place rather than proposing what Australia's particular policy should be. Nevertheless, this still leaves the Commission with scope through its supporting research to get public attention for policy issues it sees as important. For example, the recent inquiry into aged care was preceded by a self-initiated research study identifying deficiencies in existing arrangements. Well, how potential conflicts of interest are handled is obviously central to the independence of the commissioners and their perceived credibility. And originally in the IAC, commissioners had to be full-time appointees. This had the same rationale as for the judiciary, that it would eliminate scope for conflicts that could come from other activities, particularly remunerated activities. However, in the Commission's case, that requirement became impractical over time, and currently of the 10 commissioners, apart from myself and my deputy, half are part-time. And I might also note that half our commissioners are women, a few more than you had in your day, Bill. Now, while this has been beneficial in enabling the Commission to draw on people with diverse skills and experience, it has obviously increased the potential for individual conflicts of interest, and there are accordingly provisions in the Act requiring part-timers to obtain approval for involvement in other activities, and where there's a perceived conflict, that person is quarantined from any related matter that the Commission is looking at. Well, often the first question I'm asked when I'm talking about the Commission to a foreign audience is, how are appointments made? People in other countries find that particularly intriguing. I suppose what they have in mind is, what's to stop the government loading the Commission with people chosen mainly for their political affiliations or their support for the government? Now, that has been an issue, undoubtedly, for some ad hoc policy reviews at certain times, but in my experience, it has not been thus for the Commission. Firstly, there are some formal protections within the Act. Appointments by the Governor-General, while obviously acting on the advice of the government of the day, the Governor-General must accept that I quote, the qualifications and experience of the Commissioner are relevant to the Commission's functions. Well, that obviously still allows plenty of discretion, and it'd be fair to say that any government might naturally prefer to appoint people regarded as one of ours, and such appointments no doubt have been made over the years, but rarely has this outweighed considerations of competence and credibility. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is the public scrutiny that such appointments attract and the potential for criticism if an appointment wasn't seen to be appropriate. And secondly, an appointment or appointee who was appointed on political grounds and lacked the necessary skills would actually struggle in the job. Commissioners need to preside on inquiry topics that can be quite contentious, that demand a detailed understanding of the subject matter and that ultimately require good judgment. The Commission's quite exposed to public scrutiny and must be able to defend its reasoning, particularly where its recommendations, if adopted, would have a significant impact on the community or involve some losers. So we've seen governments appoint and reappoint commissioners with no political affiliations or connections, and some who might, if anything, have been seen to have been on the other side. The integrity of appointments has been enhanced by the changes introduced in 2008 for all Commonwealth statutory appointments. These are now required to be advertised and to undergo a formal merit-based selection process with recommendations to the Minister by a panel headed by the Portfolio Secretary. Well, the other element I wanted to talk about briefly is the Commission's relationship to the Executive and to the Minister in particular. As I said, the Commission has no executive powers, and its reporting relationships within government are obviously quite different to that of a Department of State. These are best summarised as the Minister can tell the Commission what to do, but not what to say. When I put it this way at a recent international conference in Seoul, held to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Korean Development Institute, it provoked a bit of a buzz, and I took it that this distinction may be unusual internationally. The Minister has formal responsibility for the Commission's work program, and the Commission reports to and through the Minister. It's the Minister who formally commissions studies. However, proposals for Commission inquiries do not emerge only from the Minister's portfolio, that's to say the Treasury. They can originate from community groups, from state governments, from other portfolios, or indeed from the Parliament or Council of Australian governments. The Minister is required to table the Commission's final reports in Parliament within 25 sitting days, which reflects the organisation's dual role of advising government and informing Parliament and the wider community. The tasks given to the Commission are set out in terms of reference, which are made public. And while we're consulted for their workability and the scope in practice to do what is being contemplated, the terms of reference obviously come to us from the Minister and reflect his judgment and that of the Prime Minister and other relevant ministers about what's appropriate. Any other instructions from the Minister are also made public. So the intent of the Act is clear that for public inquiries, the Commission's relationship with the Minister or the government more broadly needs to be arm's length and transparent. A number of protocols and practices have developed in keeping with that. Periodic briefings are given by the Chairman to Ministers and to parliamentary committees on the Commission's activities and progress. But the specifics of particular inquiries underway and what might be recommended are not discussed, and that's understood and respected. By the same token, it's a reasonable expectation on the part of any government there be no surprises, particularly with the Commission making recommendations in what are sometimes very sensitive policy areas. Accordingly, there's a long-standing convention that the government receives briefings on a report in advance of its public release, but only after it's been signed and, as they say, gone to the printer. Now, this degree of separation can take a new government or indeed a new minister a little getting used to, and I'd suggest that it has not been the norm for other independent reviews. Which minister or portfolio has responsibility for the Productivity Commission is not specified in the Act. It has little direct bearing on the Commission's formal independence, but it can make a big difference to the relationship with the Minister and the government of the day, and more importantly, the contribution of the organisation to public policy. The Commission prospered least when it reported to a Minister with responsibility for a particular sector of the economy. The Commission's job is to assess industry or group claims for policy changes in a community-wide context, and this sometimes can be at odds with such a Minister's perceived role. Thus, when located in the industry portfolio in the 1980s, the IAC was, and I quote, withering on the vine, to use the words of a departmental secretary at that time, whereas the institution had a second lease of life when moved into the Treasury portfolio in 1987, and since then its remit has been widened and enhanced. The Act is silent on the manner and extent of the funding or resourcing of the Commission, and in practice these can have a significant bearing on an organisation's independence, or more precisely, its capacity to exercise it. Policy advisory bodies, whether standing ones like the Commission or ad hoc ones appointed for specific tasks, are most independent where they have some control over their own staffing. And reviews headed by independent figures but provided with secretariats from the relevant policy departments can in practice be somewhat constrained. And I remember an old quote from Yes Minister by Sir Humphrey, who said, "I don't care who chairs the meeting, Minister, as long as we can write the minutes." Well, The Productivity Commission and its predecessors have always benefited from having their own staff, and that's enabled the organisation to build expertise in analysis and in the processes that the Commission follows. Over time, it's also helped create a culture of independence throughout the organisation. The Commission also has been funded through a single annual appropriation, which has given it desirable flexibility in allocating its resources, although I'd hasten to add, given that this is being recorded, never more funding than was needed. I'm sure the Vice-Chancellor appreciates that. So, has the Commission's strictly independent role made a difference to public policy? You'd expect me to say yes, and I could just end it there, but I think you deserve a bit more explanation. Against the background described earlier of the twin challenges in public policy, what you could call the technical challenge of what to do, and the political challenge of how to actually implement it, the Commission and its predecessors have been able to add value in a number of ways. The most fundamental of these is that in a world of many self-interested claimants for preferment and advocates for causes, governments have been able to rely on the Commission for advice, which by its mandate must be motivated only by the public interest. At the same time, governments have been able to depend on the rigour of the research and analysis contained in the Commission's reports, knowing that its findings and recommendations have been informed by extensive consultations and tested through public scrutiny. These two features have seen the organisation being called on by governments to assist in a wide range of quite difficult policy areas that are complex and contentious, but with the prospect of a high payoff to the community if we could get it right. This is illustrated by some of the inquiries on our books this year. They include aged care, disability support, international carbon pricing policies, the education workforce, urban water policy, rural R&D support, airport regulation, planning and zoning, and the retail sector. Last year's crop included bilateral trade agreements, public versus private hospital performance, paid parental leave, gambling policy, the not-for-profit sector, and executive remuneration. I think you'll agree that all these topics pass the complexity and contention test, as well as being important to community living standards and well-being. The Commission has also been an honest broker on policy issues with interjurisdictional dimensions and has become a resource for the Council of Australian Governments. Well, the third way in which the Commission has assisted is by providing ammunition for governments and sometimes opposition parties as well in advocating policy initiatives to the public and Parliament and in countering policy proposals from special interests. For example, the evidence and analysis in Commission reports have been actively employed by the Australian Government recently in areas such as paid parental leave, against an alternative model strongly advocated by the opposition during the last election, gambling, against the strident opposition of industry interests, and executive remuneration against some vocal corporate objections. Wide-ranging reform programs such as the National Competition Policy and the current National Reform Agenda have been successfully advanced in part due to evidence produced by the Commission of the substantial potential gains. In some cases, the Commission's work has helped build active constituents for reform by demonstrating to certain industries or groups the cost to them of the status quo and the benefits of a change in policy direction. This is generally acknowledged, for example, in relation to the role played by the farming and mining associations in tariff reform and through the business support for reform of public utilities in the late 80s and 90s. But it's also been a factor in some of our more recent work in social policy areas such as aged care and Indigenous disadvantage. And we've arguably made government's selling job a bit easier through our own consultative processes, which on key policy issues such as those just mentioned have assisted public understanding and helped bring the community along. In those various ways, the Commission's inquiries and reports have helped create a more benign or receptive political environment for policy change. Finally, our processes, and in particular our draft reports, can provide a source of political learning for governments, giving them an opportunity to observe how the public responds to different policy proposals and thus better judge the politics of different options. In some cases, this has led government to accept and implement quite bold recommendations. For example, the modification of community rating in private health insurance, long regarded as untouchable. In others, it has led it to reject or defer reforms, for example, the ban on parallel importation of books. These benefits have seen the Commission being assigned an increasingly diverse range of tasks involving social and environmental as well as economic policy issues, with a large consignment of such tasks at any one time. Well, some new demands on the Commission have arisen under the so-called new paradigm of minority government at the federal level. The Commission's been called on to play an informational role in the context of negotiations with minority parties and independents, negotiations which have become important to policy outcomes. Examples include our studies on gambling, private and public hospitals, and comparative carbon policies. This is essentially an extension of the Commission's honest broker role and one that we're well placed to perform. However, there's been a further development in the past year whereby the Parliament has sought to override the government or the executive in commissioning work directly from the Productivity Commission. There have been two routes. One is by introducing legislation requiring us to undertake certain tasks, and examples are the recent bill on a cost-benefit analysis for the National Broadband Network, which was defeated, and another on foreign ownership of agricultural land, which has passed the lower house. But the second and more problematic route has been through orders by the Senate for the Commission to provide it with reports on certain matters, one related to default super fund allocation mechanisms and another to the introduction of a sovereign wealth fund. These initiatives are unprecedented in the nearly 4 decades of the institution's existence. If successful, the latter route in particular would pose obvious problems for the effective operations of the Commission in terms of logistics and the disruption of existing inquiries. But more importantly, it would also become a threat to its continued existence. It would be likely to tip the balance from any government's point of view, from the Commission being seen as an asset to it being seen as a liability. So it was with some relief that I read recent advice from the Australian Government Solicitor that such orders, going beyond requiring us to furnish documents based on information in our possession to actually undertaking new work, would exceed the Senate's powers. Now, the AGS advice is a particularly erudite piece of work and deserves to be widely read in the current political environment. Among the many sources, it cites an earlier authority, Hearn's Government of England, 1886, in quite colourful terms. And I quote, "It is the duty of Parliament to advise but not to command the Crown," in our case, the Executive. "It cannot of itself issue orders even to the doorkeepers of any public departments." Well, whether this will be accepted as the last word remains to be seen, so watch that space. In conclusion, policymaking occurs in a complex and conflicted arena, one that in many cases is hindered by lack of evidence and biased in ways that can favour special interests over the public interest. Independent policy advice can play an important role not only by helping governments determine what to do amid such competing or conflicting claims, but also by helping them achieve it through public understanding and a more benign political environment. There are degrees of independence. The Commission and its forebears was created and expressly designed to achieve it to a high degree. This has enabled the organisation to contribute to better policy development in an increasingly wide range of areas, and those qualities may be at a premium right now under the new paradigm federally, and as I've indicated, this is also raising some interesting new challenges for the organisation. Thank you very much.
Can we open up the floor now for some questions? We'll try and be as democratic as we can. We've got 2 microphones, so we're going to play a little bit of microphone tennis. So we'll try and have some from that side of the room and then over. The gentleman in the blue shirt.
Thank you. I was just wondering how you retain independence when you are dependent on the government of the day for your financing, and is there a better model that you might suggest?
Is there a better model?
Better financing model.
Yeah. Well, I think the fact that we're funded by government actually is a pretty good model, because in a way it's funding a public good that would be very hard to get private funding for without compromising the fundee. And indeed, there have been some research agencies within government that have suffered a bit from the requirement to obtain a certain proportion of their funding from the private sector. And unfortunately, no matter how independent and how good their work is, there's always a slight implication that he who pays the piper, et cetera, calls the tune. I mean, that being said, the Commission has been receiving its funding in a block amount, and that's given us flexibility and the ability to allocate the resources where we would want. It might be a different matter if we were receiving money on a contract basis per project, where I think there's the ability for the funder to apply a little bit more leverage to the fundee. So broadly, I mean, I think our role is a public role. It's best funded by government, and the current arrangements of block funding and backed up by the statutory independence that the Commission has seems to have worked pretty well.
Thank you. We've got another question over here.
Yep. Ben Cohen. In terms of the impact of the outcome, which of the projects that you've been involved with would have the largest single outcome?
I'm always asked this question and I can never answer it properly because we're doing a lot, and assessing impact is a subjective matter. I mean, if I go back to the history of the institution, it played an important role over a long time in relation to industry assistance, and particularly reducing barriers at the border, which were very costly to our economy and society. So cumulatively, you'd have to say that was a major achievement. And in fact, it set in train forces for reform behind the border, forces that required, competitive forces that made enterprises throughout the country start to have a hard look at their own competitiveness and sources of cost. And lo and behold, some of those were regulatory, some of those were to do with high public utility prices and so on. So that was a threshold one, I think. We've also done some quite important reports in the area of infrastructure services. The national energy market, it's not talked about much anymore, but that did have its origins in a report by the Productivity Commission and made quite a difference. In the social space, and this might be a little bit more contentious, I think our report on gambling had quite an impact, but possibly more impact on the headlines than in relation to the harm minimisation policies that were advocated. But again, watch that space. That story is not yet over, and we seem to have a rather passionate advocate in the presence of a senator from Tasmania who's picked up our report and he's running with it, albeit with some variations of his own relative to our recommendations. So look, I could go on, but I feel I've been too self-serving tonight already in what I've been saying, and I'll have to get a better answer to that question.
Another one down here.
Couple of key points. Firstly, congratulations on the aged care report. Brilliant piece of work. Two things that come to mind is that ministers tend to be a little bit scary and, let's say, determined in the way that they often approach departments. Curious to know how you've managed to build a culture around saying no to ministers. Back off, this is our space. I agree that you've got the structure in place, but there's a culture that flows behind that. And the flow-on impact to the brand of the Productivity Commission, which has, let's say, changed quite remarkably over the last 10 to 15 years, where now the brand of the Productivity Commission is actually seen as very independent and quite powerful.
Your comment on the brand has reminded me of the fact that New Zealand has created an organisation called the Productivity Commission, and they seem to have a sexier website than ours. But I've got a strong interest in sustaining the brand, so we're doing a little bit of work with our New Zealand cousins in that area. I guess in terms of the issue of dealing with ministers, and as you've indicated, we've worked on aged care and a range of other things, and there are ministers who have an intense interest in all of those topics. We're probably shielded or protected to some extent by the fact that we're within the Treasury portfolio and report, as I indicated, to and through the Treasurer or the Assistant Treasurer, and that's generally accepted. But there are a lot of subtleties in that, and it's very important for us to be relevant and to be able to reassure a minister, as for example Bill Shorten at the beginning of our inquiry into a national disability insurance scheme. That had been a major interest of his, to be able to reassure him that we were going to do a good job. So early on we'll spend time talking to ministers about what we're proposing to do and how we're proposing to go about the thing. But it's generally accepted that when we get close to reporting, or even partway along the track, that we don't give a running commentary on what we're doing. That's just something that has lasted a long time. It was there in Bill's time, and so we have the advantage, or I have the advantage, I guess, of a kind of an institutional approach that's broadly accepted. Having said that, I think there's a little bit of education that's required for every new administration and possibly every new minister to understand not only what the rules are, the ground rules in terms of protecting the Commission's independence, but also how that can really help the government politically to be able to say that this is an independent report by the Commission that's not been influenced in any way by the government is actually a powerful thing, provided you have trust in the institution to get it right from the government's point of view. So far so good.
Yeah, hi. You spoke about the Commission's independence. I just wanted to know that you said you work under sort of strict guidelines that are provided by the Minister when you're doing the report. And I just wanted to understand how many times the Commission has gone back to the Minister and tried to have those sort of those guidelines widened or changed. Is that something that you do, or it just hasn't happened in the past?
Well, the guidelines are referred to as terms of reference, and they are in the public domain, so anybody can access our website. And it's really, the way of thinking of it is really the task that's specified for us to respond to. And as I said, the government can tell us what to do, but not what to say. Now, sometimes it's true that, the terms of reference may be deficient in some respect. We'd make that known to the Minister and there would be an addition, but that's not really happened very often. And in fact, the provisions in the Act give us a certain amount of flexibility. So, as I indicated, we actually have, within the statute, the ability to look at other matters that are related to the matter at hand. So there's a certain amount of flexibility in relation to that. And I know when I was in New Zealand talking to a select committee of their parliament when they were thinking about introducing their own productivity commission, that question was a very important one, because the issue at the time in New Zealand was, should they create a New Zealand productivity commission that can initiate its own inquiries? And I was urging them not to try to create such a beast, for the reason that I indicated earlier, that given the power that the Commission has in the realm of ideas, it's very important that the government has some control over where it focuses its laser beam, if you like, and that's been a very important thing. Now, there'd be a problem if the government chose not to give us anything to do, but that's really not been that's not been the case. The second thing that cropped up in New Zealand in relation to their Act was whether they should have a requirement for the Commission to produce a draft report. And I was urging them that they could put that into their legislation. It's not actually in our legislation, but it comes into the guidelines as you put them or the terms of reference. And that's very important. But whether the government asked us to do a draft report or not, we would probably do one, and there's never been a case when the government has said, please don't release a draft report. Looking back over my time, and I'd be interested in Bill's own comment on this, one of the great strengths of the Commission's process has been precisely the testing of our preliminary ideas through a draft report. And if you think about some of the public reviews that have sometimes gone a bit astray, often it's because people got a surprise at the end, or because the detail hadn't really been threshed out with stakeholders sufficiently to make it a robust set of recommendations.
We've got time for just a couple more questions. So the gentleman in the green top and the gentleman in the dark suit. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm just wondering whether there's any comment you'd make to this thought, and that is, it seems to me that, and I may be wrong here, the Productivity Commission, its ideology, perhaps I could say, is very much that of free markets. And I'm wondering, are there many exceptions to that? Because certainly economists would recognise, or do recognise, that there are limitations to free markets. I don't know if I'd be right in saying it might be an oversimplification, but to an extent I think the global financial crisis, which began in the US, perhaps could be sheeted home to too much reliance on free markets amongst their banking industry and to too much deregulation. Luckily, our Campbell and Wallace reports here did recommend that we retain some regulations. I mean, we went down that path too, but not quite so far. Now, I don't know if that's quite fair, but I think that's somewhere near the mark. And so I just put that up as an example of perhaps where free markets can go crazy, and to an extent the GFC perhaps is an example of that. But the Productivity Commission, it seems to me, believes passionately in free markets. I've read some of your reports, but in years gone by, I don't keep up with them so much now. There are too many of them. And I have a great admiration for the sort of work you do, but that's the feeling I've got. Am I right in saying you believe very much in free markets? Are there times where you simply think free markets don't work? Are there times where you see regulations as being necessary still? Would it be perhaps fair to say that there was a case for tariffs once, you know, in the early 20th century, that perhaps it did help manufacturing industry? I don't know. I'm wondering, where's the limit to what you do, and is there another case? What about equity? Is that something you look at very much? Because markets are very good at it, usually. They're achieving efficiency, but not always so good at equity. Any comments?
All right, I could hold you all here for another hour. I actually gave a talk at the Whitlam Institute called Markets, How Free? ? And I guess implied in that title is my view that you almost never want to have an entirely free market. In fact, the best markets are well-regulated markets. And the point you make, I think, about financial crisis being sheeted home to inadequate regulation is right. I mean, markets are markets. All a market does really is to try to find willing buyers and sellers and find a price that they're both happy with. That's all a market does, you know. But there are many ways in which markets don't work effectively, and you need regulation, property rights, issues to do with equity and fairness and so on. All of those things come into play. I think we got a bit of a reputation as free market, passionate free marketeers, I guess, probably in the area of industry assistance and particularly in the area of tariffs. But I think we've been vindicated, because I think what became clear is that was a particular kind of intervention that ultimately was not in anybody's interests, and including the manufacturing sectors. And the manufacturing sector's under big pressure again right now with a high dollar. But you notice that no side of politics is saying, let's go back and put some barriers up to trade again, because those barriers really were getting in the way of productivity and economic performance, and ultimately the standard of living of Australians. So it's really, I guess, the mantra of the Commission, if we had one related to regulation, would not be deregulation, but appropriate regulation, and finding the ways in which regulation can meet societal objectives in least cost ways. And I mean, we've talked about aged care, we've talked about national disability insurance. In some of those cases, it's really about having better regulation, or indeed sometimes, you know, creating the scope for a bit of market pressure, but again within the framework of regulation that makes sure that you get good outcomes from that. So read my little paper on markets, how free.
Thank you very much. My question is related to the agenda setting and how the Commission then at the other end, you know, deals with it. Of course, governments have options. They may choose to use the Productivity Commission to investigate a certain subject, an issue, it may also, in some instances, choose to do the piece of work outside the Commission. You know, I would imagine that the current education review funding inquiry could have possibly been conducted by your Commission. So that's one thing. The other thing is you have, of course, a certain volume and a certain capacity to serve the government. If you suddenly, you know, face a piece of investigation that has some urgency about it and wasn't previously on the agenda, how then do you deal with it? Do you stop temporarily doing some work on some stuff and then say this now has a priority, or you say, look, Minister, you know, we're fairly filled up for the next 12 months. This has to wait a little bit. Or so. What's your answer to that?
Yeah, well, they're two good questions, and again, I could bore everybody for quite a while in answering both of them. I guess in relation to the first one, I mean, the Commission has a certain number of resources, and we need to get the most out of those. And there are certain things that that don't come our way. They're typically things, I guess, which I don't know, maybe highly politically sensitive, where the government may not like the idea of telling us what to do, but not what to say. Or there might be circumstances in which a review needs to be done in a very quick time. I mean, there have been some ideas put to us to do particular reviews where we've essentially said no because we couldn't have the public consultation process that really is the hallmark of our contribution to public policy. So when the Commission does something, people expect to have a bit of a look in at the beginning, put in a submission, and certainly to have a draft report to respond to. That's what we do. You know, that's our contribution. So, but even within that domain, we do take time, and so it's a matter for the government to choose a topic, hopefully in advance rather than in a crisis situation, that warrants that kind of attention over that period of time. And the sorts of topics I've talked about tonight are ones where that's occurred. Now, that's not to say that things don't come out of left field. And one of the arts of our forward agenda, I guess, is to leave a little bit of space in case something like executive remuneration hoves into view. And I was overseas and got a phone call from the Minister, how'd you like to do an inquiry into executive remuneration? Well, sitting in a little cafe in Syracuse at the time, it was the last thing on my mind, and I thought, what happened in the 2 weeks that I've been away from Australia to make executive remuneration such a big deal? And of course you were here and you saw what happened, and it bubbled up. And it was one of those issues where the government was on the back foot, the unions were pushing hard, they wanted a cap on executive salaries, they wanted particular ratios applied, they wanted pretty heavy-handed regulation. And the Commission was able to come into it and I guess slow things down a bit, put a bit of scrutiny, get a bit of evidence together. What's the problem? What are the possible solutions? What are the costs and benefits? And hopefully, although not all business people would agree, come up with a set of recommendations that are net positive rather than a negative. So, but as I say, there's more art than science in that, and that may have been an exception in the sense that it was an urgent task that needed cooling down, you know. So our time frame actually was played to the government's favour.
Thank you. That was to be the last question, but couldn't resist the offer from the Mayor of Boroondara to pose a question. So, please.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, Gary. My question is, what is the Productivity Commission's view on overseas education, in particular tertiary education, attracting overseas students and what it means to our economy?
Well, I guess in broad terms, you know, it's obviously very, very important to us. And I know there are all sorts of policy issues around that. I mean, I actually feel that it's important to us in a number of respects. If we think about the Colombo plan and the students who came at that time and went back to their own countries and created a lot of goodwill, which we've benefited from beyond that time. That's one way. The other way, which has increasingly been happening in Australia, is that foreign students come here and end up settling in Australia, and quite a high proportion of foreign students have settled in Australia. And it's hard to think of any better migrant, really, than someone who's come as a student, worked in our universities, improved their language skills, sort of got comfortable in the country and then decided to stay. So I think the only reservation I have about that is that's human capital that perhaps they need even more in their own countries. But certainly, I mean, the education sector is a very important one to Australia, and the international component of that is very important too. Where it gets tricky, and we get back to the question of appropriate regulation, has been some of the nexus between international education and migration, and how I guess some entrants into the education industry were more seeking to exploit the kind of immigration carrot than the education asset. And I think that has been a bit of a problem, and it's caused some disturbance and so on. But certainly from the point of view of our main universities, including this one, you know, it's very important that we make international education an important part of what we do.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your questions, and thank you once again, Gary Banks. Can I now call again on our Chancellor, Bill Scales, to introduce the Vice-Chancellor? Thank you.
Gary, thanks for really an outstanding lecture. You did ask me a question, actually, about draft reports. And in some ways, it is interesting because I think the whole idea of a draft report plays a quite different... It plays, in addition to the points that you made, it plays this very interesting educational role, because what happens with public inquiries, even the ones that I'm currently doing at the moment, what you actually get is the public view changing over time if you carry them out well. Because what you're also trying to do is to put into the arena a whole range of new ideas that people can begin to think about and digest and argue amongst themselves about and so on. And in some ways, the inquiry process almost has an outcome of its own, because it's quite amazing how at the end of some of these inquiries, particularly some of the complex and difficult ones that Gary mentioned, people are over here when the inquiry starts. But if you treat people with enormous respect and take into account their views, by the time the inquiry's over, it's really interesting how people tend to coalesce around the right outcome. And I think Gary's point about the draft report is absolutely right, because that's one of the important processes that's followed to enable people to coalesce around what actually makes good sense in the long run for the community at large. Peter, can I just make a comment about your question? I'm sorry to do this, but I mean, your point's a really important one, but just to support Gary, a lot of people would never have thought that the report that Gary did actually into research and development going back into the early 1990s recommended that government double its contribution in R&D. Now, it came as a huge surprise to people that the Productivity Commission would actually say double the contribution from the public purse into research and development. And why did Gary and his team do that? He did it because he said the efficiency gain for the whole of the Australian community would be enhanced. So I think, in a way, what the Commission, particularly under Gary, has done is actually take a very broad view that actually asks a much broader question. In fact, how does equity enhance, broadly defined, by those sorts of issues? So I think it's not so much about a sort of an ideological point of view that the Commission has done, but they actually come at it from this point of view that says, on the basis of the evidence, what makes sense? Another one is the whole question about private contributions to public education. The Commission has been on the record to say there has to be both a public and a private contribution to public education. Yet most people wouldn't recognise that that's something the Commission would say. Can I answer Ben's question? Ben, a lot of people would never have recognised, for example, that in 1990, before water reform was on anybody's agenda, these guys did it. These guys started to talk about issues like maybe we should put a price on water. Before it was, anything that people would talk about, huge change in the environment as a result of what Gary and his team have been doing over a long period of time. Anyway, I'm here to introduce Linda, but also really to say, thank you to Gary. I mean, I think Gary's one. I don't say this lightly. I think Gary is just simply a great Australian, and the work that he does and the work that he and his team do is just outstanding. I must tell you another anecdote. I got this really interesting call when I was chair, and I say it for a reason. I got this really interesting call from Jack Nasser. Drop a few names here and there, as I like to do. And at that time, he had left Australia, and he was, Jack Nasser's head of BHP, and he was working then as head of Ford. He was the CEO of Ford. And he used to very graciously always just send me a Christmas card, because I used to deal with him when I was working, implementing the Button Car Plan, and we sort of became friends in a funny sort of way. I put it that way, really. Anyway, he sent me this Christmas card, and on it he said, "What the United States needs is a productivity commission," and because he could see that it was in his interests to get the sort of, broadly rational debate about what is in the best interest of the community through an organisation like the Productivity Commission. So these guys do outstanding work. I would now like to introduce Swinburne's Vice-Chancellor, Professor Linda Christensen, to formally thank Gary for being with us tonight. Most of you would know that Linda's academic career spans 30 years and includes participation in education and research in 3 countries, Canada, the US and now Australia. Linda is a specialist in clinical palliative care research and has held positions on the National Cancer Institute of Canada's Research Scientific Committee and the National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia. Not long after arriving in Australia some 15 years ago, Linda established the West Australian Centre for Cancer and Palliative Care. Linda has also served as Deputy Chair of the Board of the Australian Primary Health Care Research Institute. Prior to Linda's appointment as Vice-Chancellor here at Swinburne, Linda was Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research at Curtin University. In 2002, Linda was named the Telstra Businesswoman of the Year in recognition of her entrepreneurial work in health and science. During her academic career, Linda and her work has attracted more than $30 million in competitive research funding, and Linda has published more than 200 referees articles. Of course, one of Linda's key roles is to maintain Swinburne's research reputation. Please make Linda welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chancellor, and let me begin by just offering my warm welcome to alumni, colleagues, friends of Swinburne. It's wonderful to have you here tonight, and it's a privilege to be able to thank our guest speaker after such a thoughtful and reassuring and trustworthy presentation. Seeing as the Chancellor is taking a little liberty with his script, I thought I might just say something. I can't let this moment go by without, I think, commenting on the question that was raised. So thank you to our Mayor from Burundura, thank you, Nicholas, for asking the question about the role of international students. It so happens that today, speaking of inquiries and investigations, the report of the Knight Review that undertook to examine the importance of international student education and the linkages between international education, visa regulations and policy settings was released today. Or was released recently, and the government has endorsed all recommendations in that report. I'm extremely gratified, as are our colleagues, that this report is a very sensible report. I think that what has happened in the past has been some confusing messages, some rather careless policy settings that have been an overreaction to some international education offered by providers that were not providing quality education, and perhaps attracting students for the wrong reasons into less credible courses. That damaged the brand within Australia. And that has hurt this sector. It has certainly hurt the export of education internationally. But more importantly, I think it has had a tarnishing effect on the message about Australians and the extent to which we are a welcoming country. That's a sad thing, and I'm grateful that Malcolm Fraser is raising that question in discussion and encouraging us to return to our roots as a country that does give people a fair go. So the policy recommendations that will be coming through, I think, will allow us to provide opportunities again for students to come, to be welcomed to undertake education with us, to find sensible pathways to employment, if that makes sense. But it will also allow us to continue to create a forum within which we can provide more diplomatic harmony in the region, because when you bring students and you educate students with you, we share values, we share understandings, and even if students don't stay with us, they return and as lifelong friends and alumni. It's particularly important for Swinburne University because we were one of the first universities to embrace the Colombo Plan. We have students here, 25% of our students are international students, and they come from 95 countries. And that means in actual fact that all students are international students because they have an opportunity to work with students, to learn from others across cultural boundaries. And we believe that when they graduate, they're better prepared to work in different settings in an international way. So I think today is a very important step in our policy settings as a country. And I wanted to just take the liberty of just commenting on how important it is and the leadership role that Swinburne's playing to try and foster that more positive message. I would like to now take an opportunity to offer my sincere thanks to you, Gary Banks, for your very informative and engaging presentation. We greatly appreciate your contribution to the Swinburne community tonight and your willingness to share your expertise with us as you outlined the work of the Productivity Commission in providing independent and trustworthy policy advice to government. In identifying regulatory reform opportunities and evaluating reform outcomes on a range of economic, social, and environmental issues, the Commission fulfills a critical role in helping governments determine what to do. Over the years, the Productivity Commission has contributed to increasingly diverse policy areas affecting the welfare of all Australians. At Swinburne, our interest and engagement with the vital and highly relevant work of the Productivity Commission is clear. As a university, we participate actively in research and policy debate in many fields, including education, housing, urban sustainability, citizenship and democracy, immigration, communication, public administration, and infrastructure. The research we undertake ranges from theoretical, scientific, and social advances and new ways of understanding to innovative projects conducted in collaboration with our industry partners. Our work is driven by a commitment to excellence, intellectual rigor, and a long-held sense of responsibility to contribute to public policy and innovation. In that sense, Swinburne and the Productivity Commission share an aspiration to determine the best ways forward for Australia's economic performance and community well-being, and ensure that the chosen policies will be in the national interest. So once again, I say thank you so much, Gary, for delivering tonight's most informative and thoughtful lecture. And on behalf of Swinburne, I'd like to present you with a small gift as a memento of tonight and as a token of our appreciation.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes tonight's lecture. So I'd like to thank you all once again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. So keep watching what's happening, have a look at the website, and we'll keep you posted on what's coming up soon. Thanks again and safe journey home. Good night.
This has been a Swinburne production.